Imagine for a moment that someone knows your deepest fears, your most hidden insecurities, and the exact buttons to press to make you react before you even realize it. And now imagine that this person is not a stranger on the street, but someone you trust, someone you care about, or even yourself. Because what if I told you that your emotions are not just your own, but a battlefield where manipulation is already happening without your conscious awareness? And the consequences are more dangerous than you might think. Most people believe manipulation is obvious, something that happens in obvious scams or in dramatic betrayals. But the truth is far more subtle and far more pervasive, and it begins long before you even notice the signs, with patterns so ingrained in human behavior that you have likely been experiencing them for years without realizing it. Emotional manipulation thrives in the invisible spaces of your mind, in the small doubts, the fleeting moments of guilt, the sudden surges of anger or joy that seem irrational, but are carefully guided by someone who understands how your brain works. And once you see the mechanisms, you can never unsee them, because the truth is that you have already been primed to respond in predictable ways. You might be thinking, this is paranoia, but consider this. Every advertisement you've ever clicked on, every post you've scrolled past, every social interaction that left you confused or doubting yourself is a tiny demonstration of how your emotions are being read, analyzed, and triggered. And if businesses, marketers, and strangers can do this, imagine what someone with intimate knowledge of your personality can achieve. Manipulators do not operate in broad strokes. They are artists of the psychological brush, painting invisible pressures onto the canvas of your mind, using praise, criticism, silence, and charm in ways that feel natural but are strategically calculated. And the sad part is that the more emotionally intelligent you are, the easier you are to manipulate, because your self-awareness makes you predictable in your reactions. You may have noticed that certain people can make you feel guilty without explanation, or excited without reason, or anxious when everything seems fine. And the reason is that they have learned to exploit the most basic wiring of your brain, targeting the primal circuits that govern your desire for acceptance, your need for love, and your fear of rejection. And it starts with observation, a quiet, almost imperceptible study of your habits, your responses, and even the timing of your moods. Because emotional manipulators don't need force. They need insight, and insight turns into leverage. This is why manipulation is rarely obvious. It is slow, deliberate, and perfectly timed, exploiting moments when you are vulnerable, tired, distracted, or emotionally invested. And by the time you notice it, the manipulator has already built a network of reactions inside your mind, a map of predictable behaviors that they can trigger at will. And the more intimate the relationship, the more effective the manipulation. Because trust is the vehicle through which control moves silently and without resistance. It is terrifying to realize that your reactions, your emotions, your moments of doubt, and even your decisions can be carefully orchestrated by someone who appears kind, caring, or familiar. And the first step to defending yourself is to understand the subtle strategies they use to take control of your emotional reality. Manipulation often begins with mirroring, a tactic so subtle it can feel like empathy, but is in reality a calculated reflection of your desires, fears, and moods. And when someone mirrors you perfectly, it creates an illusion of connection, of understanding, and of safety, which lowers your guard and makes you more susceptible to influence. Because your brain interprets familiarity as trust, and trust is the most powerful tool a manipulator can wield. Once this bridge is built, manipulators introduce tiny inconsistencies, small favors, or microaggressions that destabilize your sense of reality, making you question your judgment, doubt your memory, or even feel that your emotional reactions are irrational. and these moments are strategically spaced so that you never see the full pattern until it is almost too late, leaving you trapped in a cycle where you constantly seek approval, validation, or resolution from the very person who is shaping your emotional landscape. The danger lies not just in the manipulation itself, but in the way it rewires your perception of self, creating dependency, uncertainty, and a heightened sensitivity to approval or disapproval. And over time, these effects compound, altering your decision-making, your confidence, and even your understanding of your own desires. Because emotional manipulators know that to control someone fully, you must control how they feel about themselves. And here's the twist that most people never see coming. Emotional manipulation is not always malicious in the obvious sense. Sometimes it is subtle, cloaked in charm, concern, or persuasion, and the manipulator may even believe their actions are justified or harmless, which makes detection even harder, because your brain constantly searches for reasons to forgive, rationalize, or downplay behaviors that are inconsistent with the person's perceived intentions. And this creates an internal conflict that the manipulator can exploit, turning your own empathy against you and making you question your instincts. By the time you notice patterns of guilt-tripping, gaslighting, or emotional triangulation, the manipulator has often already created a network of triggers in your mind, so that a word, a look, or a moment of silence can send you spiraling. And the frightening part is that these triggers are almost invisible to you, hidden in the subtle rhythms of interaction, in the timing of gestures, and in the way emotions are leveraged as tools of influence. Because manipulation is not about brute force. It is about understanding the machinery of the human psyche and bending it quietly, invisibly, and with devastating precision. Now, the reason you feel both disturbed and fascinated by this is because your brain is wired to detect patterns, and manipulation exploits that wiring, creating emotional loops where you chase approval, fear rejection, or seek clarity in confusion. And in those loops, the manipulator becomes the architect of your feelings, quietly dictating your reactions, shaping your behaviors, and controlling the emotional environment in ways that feel organic but are entirely orchestrated. And once you grasp this, you begin to notice the signs everywhere, the compliments that feel like obligations, the help that creates debt, the silences that trigger anxiety, and the tiny inconsistencies that leave you questioning yourself. And all of these are calculated to produce predictable outcomes without ever needing to force action. Once you start noticing these subtle patterns, it becomes almost impossible to ignore the reality of emotional manipulation, because manipulators rely on predictable human instincts, and your natural responses are their playground, where every doubt, every hope, every fleeting surge of anger or desire can be turned into a lever to push you in the direction they want. And the scariest part is that these manipulations are often invisible until you step back and observe the larger design, a web of influence that feels like coincidence, intuition, or even fate, but is nothing of the sort. Manipulators often begin with small favors or gestures, tiny acts of kindness that feel genuine, but are actually the first threads in a web of psychological dependency. Because when someone does something for you, your brain naturally wants to reciprocate, and this instinctual drive to repay kindness is one of the oldest tools of influence in human history. And when wielded by someone who understands the subtle psychology of emotions, it becomes a weapon of control. The next step in their playbook often involves emotional inconsistency, which might sound counterintuitive, but inconsistency is a tool that destabilizes your perception of reality, making you doubt your own judgment and search desperately for explanations. And in that search, you become malleable, more willing to accept narratives, excuses, or reasoning provided by the manipulator, because your brain is wired to resolve uncertainty, and and manipulators exploit this need with calculated precision, spacing moments of praise, criticism, attention, and neglect in a rhythm that keeps you constantly off balance, like a psychological seesaw, so that you are never fully confident in your own perception or in the stability of your emotional environment. Gaslighting is a classic example of this, where the manipulator rewrites events, denies facts, or reframes conversations to make you question your memory, perception, or even your sanity. And while it might seem extreme, the truth is that gaslighting exists on a spectrum, from subtle reframing of small incidents to full-blown psychological distortion. And it is effective because your brain naturally trusts external validation, especially from those it cares about, over internal observation, creating a dependency on the manipulator for clarity, certainty, and emotional balance. Guilt is another incredibly powerful lever, and it is perhaps the most underestimated tactic, because it does not require overt control or confrontation, only the quiet injection of doubt, the subtle reminder that you are not enough, or the implication that your happiness or choices cause discomfort to others. And because your brain is wired to seek social harmony, to avoid conflict, and to feel responsible for the emotional states of others, you are primed to respond with self-blame, overcompensation, or submission, without ever recognizing that your reactions are being manipulated. And over time, these patterns reinforce themselves, creating an internalized sense of obligation that feels like morality but is actually strategic influence. Emotional manipulators often layer these tactics, combining guilt with charm, inconsistency with praise, or subtle criticism with attention, creating a complex matrix of triggers that ensures you are constantly reacting, analyzing, and seeking approval. And this constant mental engagement drains your emotional resources while keeping the manipulator firmly in control, because an occupied mind is an obedient mind. One of the most insidious aspects of manipulation is that it often masquerades as love, friendship, mentorship, or guidance, because humans are wired to trust those who appear invested in our well-being, and manipulators exploit this trust by presenting themselves as allies, confidants, or protectors, while secretly shaping your emotions to serve their own goals. And this duality, the apparent caring versus the hidden agenda, creates an internal tension that is both confusing and addictive, because you are constantly trying to reconcile the affection you feel with the unease their actions create. And this tension keeps you psychologically tethered to the manipulator, unable to break free even when the evidence of manipulation is staring you in the face. This is why emotional manipulation is often most effective in relationships that involve intimacy or authority, because your brain naturally lowers its guard with those it perceives as safe, creating a pathway for subtle, persistent influence that feels natural, justified, and even deserved. Manipulators also understand timing at a deep level, knowing precisely when to introduce praise, criticism, or emotional triggers to achieve maximum effect. And this is why emotional manipulation often feels like a roller coaster, with peaks of validation and valleys of doubt, designed to keep you emotionally tethered. And each cycle reinforces the manipulator's control, because your brain begins to anticipate reactions, seek approval, and adjust behavior to maintain a sense of stability or acceptance, all while the manipulator remains steps ahead, orchestrating the emotional rhythm without ever appearing coercive. The genius of this approach is that it creates the illusion of autonomy, making you believe that your reactions are voluntary, that your decisions are self-directed, when in reality, they are preconditioned by the manipulator's careful study of your psychology, your vulnerabilities, and the patterns of your emotional responses. And once you recognize this, it becomes chillingly clear that most of the time, you are not acting entirely on your own, but in subtle synchrony with someone else's intentions. Fear is another critical tool, and manipulators wield it with subtlety, embedding it in casual remarks, hypothetical scenarios, or implied consequences, so that you begin to regulate your behavior preemptively to avoid discomfort, conflict, or disapproval. And the brilliance of fear-based manipulation is that it works even when the threat is not immediate, because your brain responds to the anticipation of negative outcomes as strongly as it does to actual danger, creating a constant low-level tension that makes you more compliant, more cautious, and more reliant on the manipulator for guidance or reassurance. Over time, these tactics compound, forming a psychological architecture that shapes not just your immediate emotions, but your long-term decision-making, values, and self-perception. And once the architecture is in place, escaping it is not just a matter of recognizing manipulation, but of rewiring deeply ingrained patterns of thought, emotional responses, and trust, which is why so many people remain trapped in manipulative dynamics for years, sometimes decades, unaware that their emotional autonomy has been quietly eroded. And yet, the most frightening aspect of all is that emotional manipulation does not always leave visible scars, which makes it difficult to validate your experience, to trust your own perceptions, or to articulate what is happening, because the manipulator often combines subtlety, charm, and strategic emotional pressure in ways that feel normal, expected, or even justified. And by the time you begin to sense the manipulation, your mind has already internalized a set of rules, fears, and responses designed to keep you aligned with their influence, making freedom not just an emotional challenge, but a psychological battle that requires insight, awareness, and deliberate effort to reclaim your autonomy. The more you understand these psychological mechanisms, the more you begin to recognize that emotional manipulation is not a rare, dramatic event reserved for villains or toxic personalities, but a subtle and pervasive influence woven into everyday interactions. And the terrifying truth is that most people who manipulate you are not doing it with cartoonish malice, but with a quiet, unconscious instinct for control, shaped by their own fears, insecurities, and unresolved trauma, which means you may already be entangled in manipulative dynamics without ever having realized that your emotions are being guided, shaped, or redirected by someone else's survival instincts masquerading as affection, concern, or authority. You might think manipulation is easy to spot, but real emotional manipulation is almost invisible because it happens in the tiniest moments, like when someone shifts their tone after you disagree with them, creating a sudden heaviness in the room that makes you second-guess your stance, or when a friend subtly reminds you of everything they've done for you right after you say no to a request, or when a partner withdraws affection the moment you express a boundary, teaching you unconsciously that love must be earned through compliance. And each of these moments seems insignificant in isolation, but together they form a psychological blueprint designed to condition your behavior. Consider the example of the silent disappointment tactic, which is one of the most effective emotional manipulation tools, because it requires no words, no confrontation, and no visible aggression, only a subtle shift in energy, a sigh, a pause, a change in facial expression that signals you have somehow failed or fallen short. And because humans are wired to detect micro-expressions and respond to emotional cues, your brain immediately begins searching for what you did wrong, even if there was no wrongdoing at all. And this internal search for fault conditions you to become hyper-aware, hyper-responsible, and hyper-compliant, creating an emotional loop where you adjust your behavior, not to upset the equilibrium, but to avoid experiencing the feeling of disappointing someone who has conditioned you to link your self-worth to their approval. In relationships, This silent disappointment becomes a form of wordless punishment, a psychological chokehold that keeps you walking on eggshells, trying to predict emotional storms before they hit. And the more you adjust yourself to avoid triggering disappointment, the more power the manipulator gains. Because the goal is not the disappointment itself, but the control that grows from your fear of it. Another powerful example is the confusion and clarity cycle, where a manipulator intentionally creates emotional turbulence through mixed messages, contradictory statements, shifting boundaries, or sudden mood changes, and then steps in as the source of calm, explanation, or reassurance, reinforcing the idea that they are the only one who can bring stability to the chaos they created. And this psychological sleight of hand is so effective because your brain is wired to latch onto the first source of relief after stress, forming emotional bonds not based on trust or safety, but on dependency, which is why people often remain loyal to, or even deeply in love with, those who manipulate them. Because the manipulator engineers both the problem and the solution, making you feel grateful for the very relief that should never have been necessary in the first place. This cycle is especially dangerous because it conditions you to associate emotional highs with the manipulator's approval and emotional lows with your own perceived failures, creating a reward-punishment dynamic that resembles addiction far more than love. Then there's the tactic known as emotional baiting, where manipulators intentionally provoke a reaction through subtle insults, ambiguous statements, selective honesty, or strategic silence, not because they are seeking a fight, but because they want data, and every emotional reaction you give becomes information for them to use, a map of your triggers, fears, desires, and weaknesses that they will later exploit with precision. And the cruel irony is that the more emotionally expressive, honest, or vulnerable you are, the more ammunition they gain, turning your authenticity into their strategy. Emotional baiting works because the manipulator is playing a long game, collecting your emotional patterns like puzzle pieces, storing them away until the moment they want to redirect your choices, silence your resistance, or extract compliance. And when you finally react in a moment of frustration or pain, they flip the narrative, making your reaction the problem instead of their provocation, leaving you apologizing for emotions they intentionally triggered. And this reversal of responsibility is one of the clearest signs that manipulation is occurring. Triangulation is another tactic that destroys emotional balance by introducing a third person, real or imaginary, into the dynamic to create insecurity, competition, or urgency. And manipulators use triangulation because they know the human brain is deeply sensitive to social comparison and exclusion, meaning that when they mention how someone else listens better, supports them more, understands them more deeply, or treats them more kindly, your brain interprets it as a social threat, triggering anxiety, fear of loss, and a subconscious drive to perform better, to regain emotional safety. And this tactic is especially deadly because it can make you compete for affection you should already have, turning love into a race you can never win because the goalposts are always moving at the manipulator's discretion. In friendships, workplaces, or families, triangulation appears in phrases like, "Everyone else thinks you're overreacting," or "Other people appreciate what I do more than you do," creating the illusion of consensus, isolating you from your own judgment and pushing you to align yourself even more closely with the manipulator to reclaim a sense of belonging. One of the darkest forms of emotional manipulation is the self-victimization switch, where the manipulator flips the script and positions themselves as the hurt, misunderstood, or mistreated party the moment you bring up a valid concern, boundary, or complaint. And this tactic works because humans are wired to respond to vulnerability with empathy, making you feel guilty for causing distress even when you were simply asserting your rights, which turns your boundaries into burdens and your needs into perceived attacks, effectively silencing your voice and training you to suppress anything that might threaten the manipulator's emotional comfort. Over time, this creates a dynamic where the manipulator's emotions become the priority, while yours become invisible, minimized, or portrayed as unreasonable, making it impossible to express discomfort without being framed as the villain in your own story. Projection is another manipulative tactic that flips reality by accusing you of feelings, motives, or actions that the manipulator themselves is guilty of. And this psychological mirror trap forces you into a defensive posture, making you explain, justify, and prove your innocence, which shifts the focus away from their behavior entirely and puts the emotional burden on you. And because projection triggers a deep instinct to protect your integrity, you fall into the trap of arguing against lies instead of questioning why the false accusations exist in the first place. Projection is especially effective because it disorients you, making you doubt your emotional compass and question whether you are actually the problem. And once the manipulator succeeds in making you defend yourself against their accusations, they have successfully shifted control of the narrative. The uncanny thing about all these tactics is that they work not because you are weak, naive, or unaware, but because they target the exact qualities that make you emotionally intelligent: your empathy, your sensitivity, your loyalty, your desire for harmony, your capacity for love, turning your strengths into vulnerabilities in the hands of someone who sees emotions as a tool rather than a bond. And once you understand this, you begin to see that emotional manipulation is not just about control, but about exploiting the parts of you that make you human. And this is why breaking free from manipulation feels so psychologically disorienting, because you are not just reclaiming your boundaries, but unlearning a system of emotional conditioning that was designed to keep you quietly compliant. The deeper you explore the psychology behind emotional manipulation, the more you realize that these tactics work, not because you lack intelligence or strength, but because your brain is governed by ancient survival mechanisms that evolved long before modern relationships, social dynamics, or emotional language existed. And manipulators exploit these mechanisms with surgical precision, taking advantage of instincts that once kept you alive in primitive environments, but now make you vulnerable to psychological influence in a world where threats are emotional rather than physical. The human brain is wired for connection, meaning that safety, belonging, and acceptance are not just desires, but biological necessities. And when these needs are threatened through silence, disapproval, inconsistency, or emotional withdrawal, your nervous system reacts as if you are facing a real danger, flooding you with anxiety, hypervigilance, and a desperate urge to restore harmony, which is the exact emotional state manipulators need you to be in to maintain control. One of the most powerful forces behind emotional manipulation is the brain's reliance on predictive processing, a mechanism where your mind constantly tries to anticipate what will happen next in order to reduce uncertainty and conserve energy. And this instinct becomes a vulnerability when someone intentionally distorts your expectations by alternating between warmth and coldness, affection and distance, honesty and ambiguity, creating a psychological fog where your brain becomes so focused on deciphering their behavior that you lose awareness of your own emotional patterns, making you easy to control because the mind cannot fight manipulation while it is busy trying to decode it. This predictive confusion weakens your ability to trust your instincts, clouding your internal signals and making you more likely to rely on the manipulator's reactions, explanations, or approval as the source of emotional clarity which gradually gives them authority over not just your emotions, but your perception of reality. Another major psychological mechanism that manipulators exploit is attachment conditioning, which is rooted in the brain's earliest developmental wiring, where patterns of affection, reward, and punishment form the basis of your emotional responses in adulthood. And when a manipulator uses hot and cold behavior or intermittent reinforcement, they are tapping into the same neurological pathways that form addictive bonds, because inconsistent rewards trigger a dopamine cycle in the brain that is far stronger and more compulsive than consistent love ever could be, making you chase validation with increasing urgency, even as the manipulator gives less and less of it, turning emotional connection into a neurological hook that keeps you tied to the relationship long after the logic has left your mind. This is why victims of manipulation often describe the dynamic as intoxicating, addictive, or impossible to step away from, because the bond is not emotional anymore. It is chemical, a neurobiological loop designed to keep you invested. Cognitive dissonance is another psychological structure that manipulators use to bend your emotions. Because when someone you trust or love hurts you, but also shows moments of affection or care, your brain struggles to reconcile the contradiction, creating an internal tension that makes you more likely to justify, minimize, or rationalize their harmful behavior in order to preserve the emotional bond. And manipulators rely on this mental conflict to keep you anchored, slowly reshaping your understanding of what love, loyalty, and respect should look like, until you begin to accept harmful behavior as normal, inevitable, or even deserved. The more contradiction your mind tries to resolve, the deeper your emotional investment becomes, trapping you in a cycle where leaving feels like betrayal, staying feels like sacrifice, and questioning the manipulator feels like disloyalty, even though your emotional suffering is a direct result of their intentional actions. Neuroscience reveals another unsettling truth. Your brain is biased toward emotional shortcuts, meaning that when someone triggers basic feelings like fear, guilt, shame, or hope, your logical thinking becomes secondary, because the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, overrides the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic and reasoning, making you react emotionally before you think rationally, which allows manipulators to bypass your intelligence entirely by targeting the emotional circuits that evolved for survival, not modern relationships. When a manipulator creates an emotional spike, whether through a sudden argument, a guilt-heavy comment, a dramatic story, or a moment of affection, your brain enters a state where it prioritizes making the emotion stop over making sense of the situation. And manipulators use this moment of vulnerability to redirect your choices, control your reactions, and reinforce the idea that emotional relief comes from compliance, silence, or self-blame. Another potent cognitive mechanism is confirmation bias, where your brain naturally seeks evidence that supports what you already believe. And manipulators weaponize this by creating a narrative early in the relationship, such as, "I only want what's best for you," or "you're overreacting," or "everyone misunderstands me." Because once that belief is embedded, your brain will subconsciously filter information to support it, ignoring conflicting evidence and amplifying anything that aligns with the manipulator's desired image, making you blind to red flags, because your mind is trying to preserve your internal story rather than challenge it. This makes it extremely difficult to recognize manipulation while you are inside it, because your brain protects the emotional bond by distorting the truth, twisting your perceptions to keep the relationship intact, even if the relationship is quietly destroying your emotional well-being. Memory distortion is another frightening psychological consequence of manipulation, because manipulators often reframe past events, through denial, selective truth, exaggeration, or half-remembered details, causing you to doubt your recollection, trust their version of events, and gradually lose your sense of what actually happened, which creates a dangerous dependency where you begin to rely on them as the gatekeeper of truth, history, and context, making your mind vulnerable to subtle rewriting over time. This is how people end up defending manipulators, apologizing for things they never did, or accepting blame for situations they didn't cause, because the brain eventually replaces its own memory with the manipulated version, creating a psychological reality shaped by someone else's intentions rather than your own experiences. Another critical psychological principle is emotional reciprocity, the instinctive human tendency to return emotion with emotion, which manipulators exploit by strategically showing vulnerability, sadness, disappointment, or hurt whenever you assert a boundary or express your needs, triggering your empathy and making you feel responsible for their emotional state, even though those reactions are often exaggerated, rehearsed, or intentionally timed to keep you compliant. This emotional mirroring hijacks your compassion, turning your empathy into a leash around your behavior, making you suppress your own voice to protect their feelings, even though their feelings are merely tools in a larger strategy of influence. Finally, one of the most dangerous psychological factors is the brain's preference for emotional familiarity over emotional safety, meaning your mind is more likely to cling to a harmful but familiar emotional pattern than to embrace a healthy but unfamiliar one. Because familiarity feels like stability to the subconscious, even if it is destructive, and manipulators rely on this instinct to keep you tethered, creating emotional cycles that feel predictable in their chaos, comfortable in their discomfort, and strangely safe in their instability, because the brain would rather choose a known pain than an unknown peace. This is why people repeatedly return to manipulative relationships, justify toxic behaviors, or normalize emotional mistreatment, not because they want suffering, but because the manipulator has reprogrammed their nervous system to associate emotional volatility with connection. And this is where everything comes together. Because once you recognize the mechanics behind emotional manipulation, you start to notice something eerie. It's everywhere, layered into conversations, hidden in apologies, woven into compliments, buried inside guilt trips, disguised as love, or even wrapped in advice that sounds wise but feels vaguely suffocating. And the craziest part is that once you learn to see it, you can't unsee it. Not in your relationships, not in your friendships, not in your workplace, and sometimes not even in yourself, because emotional manipulation spreads quietly like fog, until suddenly a person wakes up one day and realizes they haven't been steering their own life for a very long time. So let's close with the one thing manipulators never expected you to learn: how to take your power back without shouting, without fighting, and without letting them pull you back into the same emotional maze they've built around you. And the first step, the one manipulators hate the most, is emotional detachment. Not coldness, not cruelty, but a calm, controlled distance inside of you where their reactions no longer dictate yours. And this is powerful because manipulation relies on emotional hooks: fear, guilt, validation, approval, shame, responsibility, obligation. So when you stop reacting impulsively, when you stop trying to win, explain, defend, or prove yourself, their hooks start slipping out on their own, and they feel it. They sense it instantly, because manipulators read emotional energy the way some people read books. And when they notice the shift, they usually double down at first, exaggerating the guilt, intensifying the flattery, escalating the fear, trying absolutely anything to make you feel again, because your emotions were the strings connected to their control. But this time, something inside you won't move, won't flinch, won't bend, because you finally understand that your emotions belong to you, not them. And once that realization settles in, everything changes. And the next step is reclaiming your boundaries. And here's the twist. You don't strengthen boundaries by yelling no louder or by lecturing the manipulator on how they hurt you, because they already know, and many of them are counting on your emotional explanations so they can twist your words again. No, boundaries become powerful when they're simple, neutral, consistent, and unbothered. Like, I'm not available for that. Or, that doesn't work for me. Or, I won't continue this conversation if you speak to me that way. And saying it without raising your voice, without trembling, without defending yourself, creates a kind of psychological silence that most manipulators can't operate in, because they need your emotional energy to fuel the dynamic. And when you stop giving it to them, it feels to them like trying to start a fire with wet matches. And sure, some of them will get angry, some will play the victim, some will pretend they don't understand, some will act confused, some will accuse you of being difficult or cold or unreasonable. But what matters is that you stay consistent, because manipulation loses its power when the target becomes stable, calm, predictable, and immune to emotional bait. And another thing that catches manipulators off guard is when you start trusting your own perceptions again, because one of their favorite tactics is making you doubt what you felt, what you saw, what you heard, or what you experienced. But once you stop outsourcing your reality to them, they lose the doorway they used to enter your mind in the first place. And this is why self-trust is so dangerous to manipulators, because it means you no longer need their approval to confirm what's true, and without that leverage, their emotional influence collapses. And this is where you start noticing their patterns, noticing how they only apologize when they're afraid of losing you, noticing how the guilt shows up precisely when they want something, noticing how their tone softens when they need you and sharpens when you set boundaries, noticing how they shift between charm and pressure, like they're flipping channels, noticing how every innocent suggestion conveniently benefits them more than you, noticing how every guilt trip comes with a hidden request, and noticing how your emotions were conditioned to serve theirs. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And they know they can't hide behind it anymore. And eventually, you reach this mental clarity where manipulation becomes obvious, almost predictable, like watching a magician perform a trick whose secret you already learned. And suddenly the illusion isn't impressive anymore, because when someone tries to guilt trip you, you hear the tactic instead of the guilt. When they try to play the victim, you recognize the script instead of feeling responsible. When they try to flatter you, you spot the intention behind the praise. When they try to twist your words, you see the reframe happening in real time. When they suddenly become warm after ignoring you, you feel the swing instead of the gratitude. And when they try to drag you into an emotional reaction, you notice the bait instead of taking it. And that moment, when you see the structure behind the manipulation, is the moment you escape it forever. Because manipulation only works in the dark, in confusion, in uncertainty. And once the light comes on, the entire system falls apart. And the most surprising part of taking back your emotional power is that you don't become harder, colder, or more closed off. In fact, you become clearer, calmer, more confident, because your emotions finally become your tools instead of someone else's remote control. And you begin to notice real connection again, real respect, real honesty, because people who don't rely on manipulation communicate directly instead of indirectly, ask instead of forcing, express instead of guilting, apologize instead of deflecting, and care about how you feel instead of using how you feel to get what they want. And once you experience emotionally healthy interactions, manipulation becomes even easier to spot because the contrast is so sharp that you wonder how you ever missed it before. And this clarity becomes your protection going forward, because manipulators thrive on quick emotional reactions. But clarity slows everything down, and slow is the one speed manipulation can't operate in. And as you walk away from the people who once controlled your emotions, you'll notice something strange. Your world becomes quieter, lighter, and more spacious, because emotional manipulation constantly creates noise in your mind, second-guessing, overthinking, confusion, guilt, anxiety, tension. And when that noise disappears, you suddenly have room to think again, room to breathe again, room to feel your own emotions without filtering them through someone else's expectations. And it's in that quiet space that you finally understand something powerful. The reason manipulators targeted your emotions wasn't because you were weak, but because you were strong in ways they couldn't be. Empathetic, emotionally aware, intuitive, loyal, responsive, open-hearted. And those qualities were never flaws. They were simply misused by the wrong people. And once you use them for yourself instead of against yourself, they become your greatest strengths again. And this is the moment the whole story flips. Because the truth is, emotional manipulation only works on people who feel deeply, care deeply, and love genuinely. And once those same people learn to protect their emotional world, instead of letting anyone access it freely, they become some of the most unmanipulable individuals in the world, able to read intentions as clearly as words, able to sense emotional shifts instantly, able to recognize manipulation in seconds, and able to walk away from people who drain them instead of trying endlessly to fix what was never theirs to fix. And that's the part manipulators never expected, that once you understand their tactics, you don't just escape their influence. You become smarter, stronger, and more emotionally aware than before. Because learning how someone manipulated you teaches you how to make sure nobody ever can again. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.